Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Taylor, and today we're going to be talking about cis white men, and we're going to be talking about penises and masturbation to kind of end us off here on Masturbation May. So I hope that all of you are taking care of yourselves. I hope that you are enjoying your week. I hope you're finding space for pleasure, for rest, for joy, all of the things that you are highly, highly deserving of. And I want to get into a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. So my guest today is Cam Fraser, who is a certified professional sex coach and certified sexologist. And I got to say, I think this is a really important episode. Even in my conversation with Cam after recording, I'm really, really happy to have had him on the show. And, you know, I think when we are examining the things that we want changed in our culture, when we're examining the ways that power is imbalanced and the way that, I guess when we're acknowledging the gender differences in our culture, all of this, there typically is an oppressor and there is the person being oppressed. And when we look at the actual culture of patriarchy, of men, born gender, I can't speak words, male assigned at birth, cis men. When we look at them, we typically think, especially when they're white, we typically think, they have all the power in the world. They don't get to have any kind of feelings. They don't get to, struggle in any way because you've got it made, because everything's working in your favor, so on and so on. You know where this is going. You probably have felt this way at some point in your life. And while this is where the nuance is, right? This is where we have to challenge ourselves to hold both, because people do not exist in a box. And I think it's so important to recognize here that while someone may be in a position of power because of patriarchy, that patriarchy is still damaging for every gender, including the gender it is supposed to, benefit, right? Yes, there are some benefits, but at the end of the day, it really actually is causing a ton of harm. So I think it is super important to be able to hold these conversations, to be able to hold space for folks who are also the ones holding power, and to be able to also acknowledge the fact that these things might not actually be working in their favor as well, because that also has a ripple effect then, right? That also then changes the rest of everything else and how they and how they interact with people and interact with the systems. That just creates a ripple effect. And I think that piece is almost kind of what gives me hope, honestly. I find that in my own romantic relationships, I feel I've had to do a ton of emotional labor and emotional work with the cis white men that I have dated to unpack patriarchy, to unpack some of these things that even show up within our sex lives. So today, in one of the few episodes that I feel like we've had on the podcast, we're going to be centering cis white men in this podcast episode. And I do hope that if you are a cis white male listening, I hope that you're particularly listening with open ears, open mind, and open heart. And I hope you provide some care for yourself, provide some support for yourself. If you are a non-white cis het male, I hope you share this with someone you love and who you hold relationship with, who is a cis white male. And I particularly hope that you will listen with an open heart, open mind, open ears. Still care for yourself. Still acknowledge frustrations that might come up for you. Still totally your feelings and whatever might get triggered for you in this episode with centering this population is valid, right? So maybe take a deep breath if needed. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and really, really value this work. And I'm just very excited to introduce you all to Cam. So without any further ado, let's talk about it. Great. So welcome, Cam, to the show. Thank you so much for being here. You're all the way in Australia. So it's what time there?
It is just gone 9 o'clock in the morning here.
Okay, yeah, 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock Pacific time. So super happy that you're able to, have some flexibility to be able to make the time to come on the episode and share a bit of your personal life, a bit of your knowledge. One of the things that I've been starting to do now at the beginning of each episode with a new guest is to kind of have a moment to share identities. That way, certainly I do my introductions always, and I'm like, oh yeah, like this is who I'm going to be talking to. But I think to hear from you, a bit of how you show up in the world, of what identities you hold that impact, the rest of the conversation that we're going to have. If you could introduce yourself a little bit to listeners.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm a cishet white dude. That's like that's my demographic. Like that's who I typically try and speak to with my work. That's my lived experience. And so, I guess I'll be concise and I'll try and share a little bit of my life journey to get to where I am today, because it informs my work, right? Yeah. Like my personal experiences definitely inform the work that I do today. And those experiences, the major ones that kind of stand out to me were, I went to university in America. So I'm Australian originally, and I went to uni in America. When I was 17, I flew across, and I went to a university in Georgia. Was the first college that I went to. It was in the Bible Belt in the Deep South. And,
it's quite a cultural difference there, going from Australia to Georgia. Big
time, yeah. And so I did have a bit of culture shock, and whenever I came back to Australia on the summer holidays, all my Australian friends were like, you sound more Australian, even though you've lived in the Deep South for the last 2 years. What the hell is going on? And I think it was because I was like really trying to cling on to like my Australianness when I was in this like foreign, culture, I suppose, and having that culture shock. So, but the tagline of the university I went to was unapologetically Baptist, and it was so it was very conservative, Christian conservative, and so kind of because of the small town that we were in as well, I was in a place called Mount Vernon, Georgia, which is in the middle of Savannah and Atlanta, smack bang in rural Georgia, and the kind of mindset there around sexuality was very, let's say, repressive, I suppose. The one university level class I took on sexuality at the time, because I was studying psychology, was Christian approaches to human sexuality. And so it was very dogmatic in the sense that homosexuality was considered a sin, and premarital sex was also frowned upon, and contraception wasn't taught, and it was pleasure negative. It was very sex negative. It was just like a big shock to me coming from Australia, where we're a little bit more, let's say, liberal or open about sexuality. So kind of being in that environment for a couple of years, I was like, wow, this is intense. Like people here are like the shame and the stigma around sexuality, which is quite intense in that particular community, was really affecting these young people. And that was like the first light bulb for me. I was like, okay, there's like something here around human behavior and sexuality and the intermingling of those that kind of needs to be talked about. There's education, it really needs to kind of be stepped up. And then I went to spend 2 more years. I transferred. I spent another 2 years in a place called Dubuque in Iowa, in the tri-state area of Illinois, Iowa, and Michigan, I think. Is that the state? I'm not sure. And that was a Catholic school, Catholic university. So again, there was that kind of religious influence. I took like Catholic ethics and things like that. So there was things around sexuality and those classes, and again saw the impact that kind of religion and dogma had on people's expressions of their sexuality and how they felt comfortable showing up. And again, there was a lot of shame and stigma attached, a lot of purity culture particularly. And so again, I was studying psychology, and I was also noticing that I was having a lot of my own issues sexually as well at this time. Like I was a young guy. I went over when I was 17. So between 17 to 21, I was at university, and I kind of fell in with like the fraternity crowd. I was I don't know what it is, but Americans seem to love Australians. So when I went over there, it was just like I was welcomed with open arms, which is lovely. The hospitality was really great.
Yeah, it's a little bit of like fetishizing, a little bit of objectifying. Yeah, there were some Australians that came to my university, and I remember how a lot of the women perceived them, and I just remember being like, that's really intense.
Yeah. So it was an interesting experience, and so kind of because of that, I became like an honorary member of like a couple of fraternity houses because the fellas just wanted to be mates with the Australian dude. Yeah. But that, and I was also a college athlete as well. So I went over there to play sport. So I was in these like really hyper masculine, macho environments, little pockets of like men, I suppose. And it was really, it was really conflicting for me. Like I didn't feel super comfortable in those spaces, but those were the only spaces that I kind of felt welcomed, and so I had to like play into it, I suppose. And so the way that I talked about sex and the way that I talked about women and the way that I showed up in the world was very just that stereotypical straight white dude, and like sex was all about quantity over quality and the every hole's a goal kind of mindset, and just like misogynistic is the word to kind of sum it up, right? That was both like the college athlete space and the fraternity space, and so I was having like a lot of internal issues, and that was showing up not only kind of mentally. I was quite in a bad mental health space for that time, but also it was showing up physically as well. I was having a lot of like tension and anxiety in my body, and that was affecting me sexually. So I was struggling to get erections, to get and maintain erections. I was struggling with premature ejaculation. I was outsourcing my pleasure to porn. I was just watching a lot of porn. I was really struggling to connect intimately with the young women that I was being sexual with. I was very narrow and rigid with regards to what I thought sex was supposed to look like. And I was just having poor experiences. And so it wasn't until I'd seriously injured my back, and I fractured my spine. And through rehabilitation, through clinical Pilates and rehab, I was introduced to yoga and meditation and breath work and all these kind of healing modalities. And for the first time in my life, I actually slowed down and listened to my body and started to release tension, stored tightness in my body, which we know is connected to your emotions. And so as I was releasing tension physically, I was also starting to unlock and release these emotions that I'd been holding on to, like the grief and the frustration and the feeling of ostracization and all this stuff that had been that I'd been holding on to. I remember many times during a yoga and Pilates class, I just broke down in tears halfway through a class on the mat, or I had this like surge of anger come up out of nowhere halfway through class. And so that prompted me to go and see my own therapist and a counselor and work through a lot of these emotions and just learn how to process, like learn emotional regulation, I suppose. And that was like really impactful in the way that I started interacting with people. I started feeling more comfortable in my own body and more comfortable in my own skin and speaking up for what I kind of believed in and kind of calling out the shit that I was seeing in terms of like the behavior these other guys around me were doing. And then I noticed that like I was able to connect better with the women I was interacting with because I was just being a bit more authentic and slowing down and focusing more on pleasure rather than on the performance side of things. And that kind of really snowballed into like, well, there's something here. Like I was studying psychology and then also had these like body-based healing modalities. And I thought, they're both kind of working towards the same goal, which is that transformation. And I was like, well, how can we bring those two things together? Like, where is that intersection between these body-based and mind-based practices? Because it tends to be this like really dualistic way of thinking about psychology and physiotherapy, I suppose. And so I wanted to pursue that. And that's, I knew I said I was going to be concise, but I guess I kind of haven't. But long story short...
You're not alone. You're not alone. I struggle. I struggle too.
I was very, very interested and intrigued and passionate about these two areas of study, which is psychology and the body. And so I pursued postgraduate degrees in sexology and psychology and counselling, and when I did massage courses and yoga teacher trainings and travelled around. I was very fortunate. I was able to travel to South America, to Southeast Asia, to Central America, to all these beautiful places and like learn from those experiences. Did a bit of plant medicine, did a bit of, I ordained as a Buddhist monk in northern Thailand. I did some teacher training in India and really pushed myself to all these limits, I suppose, physically and mentally, in order to kind of bring that back into my own personal practice and the practice that I have for clients. And so like today, I kind of, like I shared at the beginning, I try and speak to myself 10 years ago. Right? I try and speak to the young man that I was, and the stuff that I needed to hear. I needed like an older guy who had a bit of experience, who shared kind of my own lived experiences and was just open and honest and knowledgeable about sexuality and masculinity, and didn't say that I had to conform to something that I felt really a lot of resistance to. And so that's what I try and do today, is just try and speak to myself as my teenage self. And that seems to resonate with a lot of people, a lot of guys, particularly, I think, regardless of socioeconomic status and ethnicity, tend to have similar experiences with regards to their masculinity and sexuality. And I try and, I just try and speak to that, and I outsource, like I said, if there's unique things with regards to like black masculinity or indigenous masculinity, I try and outsource that to people that know what they're talking about as well, because I think there's like really important stories and there's a lot of value in kind of outsourcing to those people as well. So that's where I'm at today. I've got a really beautiful sex coaching practice, and I work specifically with men. Again, that was a whole journey to get to like niching in that. And it's been a wild ride, and I've just become a father now, and thinking about raising my son and how I'm going to talk to him about sexuality as he grows up, and masculinity, and giving him the freedom to kind of express what's coming up for him. And it's just been a pretty wild 10 years, I think, and it's only kind of getting wilder. There's so much like opportunity and avenues to kind of do this work, so I'm really excited, and I'm super grateful that there's platforms like this to have these conversations. So thanks for letting me ramble.
There's so much in the rambling though, like there's so much substance, so I'm always like, I do invite the rambling. I think it's really important to just kind of see where people's train of thought goes. So I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing all of that, and I think there is so much power in talking to that younger version of yourself, and in a way you're helping heal others while also healing yourself, and kind of the opposite of that too, right? In a way, when you're healing that younger version of yourself, you're also helping heal other people through healing yourself. So I think that's a beautiful process. Something I've been doing over the last 10 years and having to take a deeper look at currently. And it is really, really powerful, strong, deep, intense work to do. And it makes a lot of sense that, you are speaking to this population, and that definitely comes through in your work. And I think, a lot of what you were talking about where you were at 10 years ago in terms of the misogyny and, essentially like upholding patriarchy in a way, that is something that impacts everyone's sex life. That's something that impacts all genders. That has been essentially what has wrote the entire script of what sex is supposed to be, quote unquote, in our mainstream dominant cultures, I think across the globe. I'm not super cultured in the whole world, but at least I guess in the States, that seems to be the pretty dominant cultural messaging around sex, and that it is kind of drenched in this misogynistic, patriarchal script.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind when I think about the way sex is portrayed is phallocentric, right? It's like very penis-oriented. Super. And yeah, I mean, we can talk more into that, but sex doesn't have to be focused on your penis. And that's something I tell a lot of men. The little saying that I have for guys is you're not just your penis, you're actually one big penis, and you can experience pleasure across your whole body. And that tends to there's a little light bulb moment for a lot of guys, oh my God, what? I'm allowed to do that?
Yeah, you're actually a huge dick, not
exactly.
just one dick. That's a great way of saying it. there were throughout whenever we talk, so I got introduced to your work actually through my chosen father, Rob. He had found your account and had been following you for a while. And I honestly, I don't know. I guess I still am relatively new entering into the field of sexology. I'm getting my PhD currently in clinical sexology, and wanting to do a ton of episodes in May focused on masturbation. And I was like, I need some penises. It's like, I need some penises. Like, I don't feel like a lot of people with penises speak on the show here. I feel like I don't hold conversation around sex in a public space with other educators necessarily who have penises. I saw, I think it was on your show, you interviewed Dr. Joe Court, who's actually one of my mentors and supervisors in the PhD program. But, you know, I think other than having him on recently, I was like, yeah, I don't know of other like white cis het men with penises that speak about sexuality in a way that's like holistic and helpful and mindful and conscious and intentional. And Rob, my chosen father, was like, yeah, you should check this guy out. And so I do have some questions that like, both from him and from like other men to ask some questions a little bit later and kind of throughout. But I was wondering if you run into that, like if you run into feeling like, you know, when you think about that version of yourself 10 years ago, like where were the mentors who looked like you, who held the identities that you did, that were like essentially giving messages, right? That like, it's okay, you are more than your penis.
Yeah, the only people that I had as role models in that space, like David Lay talks about sexual role models, like who are your sexual role models. The only people that I thought like could think of at that time were, and this sounds so horrible and I hate to say it, but were pickup artists, or like the Neil Strauss and Mystery and all these, you know, white dudes, straight white dudes who were talking about sexuality, obviously not in a very holistic way, obviously not in a very conscious and intentional and mindful way, but they were the only guys that were talking about sex at that time that I could think of, or that I had access to, that I could find anyway. And so like one of my big motivators for doing this work is to combat that community, because it's it's super prevalent online. And so, and that's a whole different conversation. But that's a big driver for me, is to like really try and offer alternatives to some of the crap that they espouse. And so I do find, unfortunately, myself being a bit of a rare breed in the sexuality space, particularly in the sexuality space that I try and, you know, be a part of, which is the holistic, sex positive, pleasure positive space, because there's not a lot of guys in there, unfortunately. And some of the guys that kind of are in there, and I obviously won't name any names, but feel at least a little bit out of integrity, just lack a little bit of that alignment as well. And, you know, I mean, there's countless stories of like sacred sexuality gurus and these male teachers who cross boundaries and have been accused of sexual assault and things like that. And it just, I'm like, I don't know, it just boggles my mind that you're in that space and that happens. So that's a big thing for me, is like abiding by professional guidelines and ethics, because fucking you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's, I mean, you know, there are a ton of sex therapists who have penises who I think do a great job of like talking about this kind of stuff. But I think people who speak out about it publicly, like people who have like a public presence, who are straight and also white and also have penises, that talk about sex in this way, in some sense, almost doesn't make sense, because you are made to believe it wouldn't actually benefit you, because you think you benefit from how the script is as is. And I think there's a lot of blind spots in that. Totally.
I resonate with that heaps, because the bane of my life is getting men to listen to me. Like I can pack out a room.
You don't say.
Yeah. Like if I do a workshop, I've done like, exclusive workshops, like one for cishet dudes, one for cishet women. And like if I do a women's workshop, I'll pack it out. And women are like eager to learn about male sexuality. They want to know about their male partners. But if I do one for the guys, it's the hardest thing to try and get that room full of men who want to talk about sexuality. But I will say, once they do show up and once they do, once that space is created for them to talk, I can't shut them up. They're like, the guys that are open to it, they are super open to it. They want to talk. And it's just about finding those guys and getting the guys who aren't really that keen to actually start to get the ball rolling and crack that door open a little bit. But it's that's been my whole business model. I structured it not very well to target, straight white dudes because they aren't super open to this work. But, slowly but surely we'll crack that nut.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully there's some cis het men listening, and if not, then their partners are listening, and maybe their partners can pass some of your work by. One of the things, so like I know you talk a lot about like, the myths and the things that like the fears and whatnot that a lot of men have with entering into this kind of like conscious and mindful sexuality, which I think we've talked a little bit about what those kind of look like, but wondering if you can speak a little bit to what some of the fears folks have in kind of working with you or going into this area.
So again, I'll preface this, and I've said it before, but like I work with cishet white guys. That's like my predominant thing. So if I'm saying men or referring to my clients, that's a demographic of people that I'm talking about. And so like these men that I work with, one of the biggest fears, I suppose, that pops up, in fact, there's a couple, and they're all kind of laid into one another, but some of them pop up are like firstly reaching out and actually seeking help in the realm of sexuality implies that they aren't all knowing when it comes to sex. And that's like a big story that we have as a society, is that men should just know what they're doing sexually, and that they should be assertive and they should take charge and they should be the leader and they should be dominant in the bedroom, and they should be able to like give their partner pleasure, and that it's their job and their responsibility. They're the active participant, right? All that kind of stuff. The way that we've kind of framed sex in our society, a lot of guys embody that unhealthily, and they sex is a skill. You've got to learn about sex and sexuality in order to be good at it. Yeah, there's a little bit of like naturalness and inherent kind of understanding to it, but for the most part, you've got to learn your partner, you've got to learn your own body, you've got to learn the things to do, and to admit that you don't know what you're doing is like, it challenges and goes against that whole story that men are supposed to be this knowledgeable partner. And so that's a huge fear that guys have when it comes to like reaching out for any type of help. And so when I start working with them and saying, look, that's fine. Like sex is a skill. Like you've got to like let go of that kind of ego, I suppose, mentality around like being good at sex, and start to like focus more on pleasure. Like that's another big fear that guys have, is like experiencing pleasure. Like guys are really good at experiencing gratification, but not so good at experiencing pleasure. And so that's a big distinction that I like to make, because guys, and again, this is just a sweeping statement, but this is what I've observed to be relatively true for the men that I work with, is guys will focus more on their partner's pleasure than they will on their own pleasure, but they'll focus more on their own gratification when it comes to sex. And kind of what I mean by this is like the way that guys talk in a locker room. If you've ever heard men talk in a locker room, you'll understand what I mean by this. But the way guys talk about sex in these locker room situations is like overemphasizing their female partner's pleasure. Like, oh, she had this many orgasms, I made her come this many times, like she was this loud, it was, I gave her a deep dicking, whatever the fucking language is for it. It's all horrendous language.
Grabbed her by the pussy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right? And it's all centered on like her, and I'll put in here, her perceived pleasure, like what he perceived that she experienced. Never will guys talk about like how much pleasure they had in environment. They'll never say, oh, I had this like full body orgasmic experience. I had all these tingles through my chest and through my face, and like I was writhing in ecstasy. Like no guys are talking like that in the locker room. They're all downplaying their own pleasure and saying, yeah, I busted the biggest nut, or I just came like so hard, or, you know, just focusing on their gratification and then focusing on this kind of false perceived female pleasure, let's say. And so like getting men to kind of go, all right, I need to just get rid of that mentality as much as possible and start focusing on like the pleasure that I can experience. And I use that in like a self-pleasuring context. So I'll help them shift from masturbation to self-pleasure, with masturbation having a lot of baggage and negative connotations to it. And oftentimes it's porn oriented as well. So I'll kind of help them focus on like the pleasure that they can experience, and just moving away from this kind of 5-second sticky white crotch sneeze, which is what a lot of guys tend to be goal oriented towards when it comes to sex and masturbation. It's like, I just need to get that end result of that ejaculation. So this kind of ejaculation focus. So shifting away from that and focusing on the pleasure they can experience tends to freak a lot of guys out. There's a lot of fear around that, because
requires vulnerability.
Sure as shit does. And there's like that surrendering into it and that letting go of it. And when guys do that, they feel like they're not in control anymore. They feel like there's this, like I use the word term letting go. There's this letting go of like expectations and what sex should look like. Because a lot of the things that, you know, yes, the way that a lot of people are having sex was just that like very phallocentric, straightforward, you know, stereotypical way, can be pleasurable, but a lot of the things that are also pleasurable don't look like that and don't fit into that mold. And so when we start to focus on pleasure and we start to realize that all these other things that don't fit that mold are actually pleasurable for us, there's again this fear of like, oh, am I weird, or is there something wrong with me because I get a lot of pleasure from this and not from penetration alone, for example. So that brings up a lot of, just challenges a lot of stories that men hold with regards to what sex should look like for them and their partner. So there's fear again. I mean, there's fear layered into a whole bunch of different things. There's the fear of like not being able to please their partner. A lot of guys have that fear come up for themselves, and they kind of measure their own masculinity based on how much pleasure their partner experiences, which is why it gets blown out of proportion and overemphasized in those locker room scenarios, because every guy is trying to one up the other guy and be more of a man. But when that comes to like just a personal, outside of those scenarios, guys are afraid of not being enough for their partner, or not being able to pleasure her, or not being able to give her enough orgasms, because a lot of guys feel like it's their responsibility. Their partner's pleasure is their own responsibility. And so a big learning that I share with people in general is that your pleasure is your own responsibility. You're not responsible for your partner's pleasure. It's not your job to give your partner an orgasm. But you facilitate each other's pleasure by talking and communicating and just being with each other in that space, and learning about each other's pleasure and asking questions and doing all the really important work, right? That communication work. So there's, I mean, I could keep going. I don't want to, because I'm sure there's other questions, but there's just a lot of fear. Like men are afraid of sex, I'll say. Like they're afraid of holistic sex and pleasure. There's just a lot of fear around it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like it's also because so much of their worth as a man is wrapped up in their penis, and their penis's ability to be valuable is dependent on this intense, again, perceived pleasure that they can give, aka help facilitate and share with a female partner. And, there really is so much pressure, I think, on men when it comes, like there's pressure on everyone when it comes to sex. But I do think especially for men, which again, in all of this seems very much like this is all created by patriarchy. And so even though it is men who are also suffering from it, does not mean that it's not also because of this, perceived power and actual tangible power that men hold in society, but that it does still create harm for them. And so, this kind of assumption and role that I think a lot of men end up playing in their relationships is in some ways teaching their female partners about their own pleasure. Like there's so much stigma around female pleasure as well, and them not having, access and sex education, even just around their fucking genitals. Like, I don't think I actually learned the difference between my vulva and my vagina until I was like 25. It was like 3 years ago. And I was like, excuse me, what? Like, okay, there's some identification there. But I think for so long, even in my own relationships and in my sex life, I did look to the men I was with to teach me about what felt pleasurable within my body. And so I think there is this, not only it inflates the ego and it helps give more of that validation of a sense of purpose, but it also, I think, feels like it's how they can then connect with their partners as well, because they're teaching and kind of showing off in a way. I love everything you said there, and it makes total sense. Part of what you were saying about, not focusing on their own pleasure. One of the questions, and this was like, I wanted to make sure I had questions from men. Needed to come from some men. So one man asked, is there ever a time where I can be too expressive of my emotions in the bedroom? And that to me sounds like fear coming up of what you were just kind of talking about.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, because I get this a lot. And I particularly get asked by, not asked by women, but I get kind of told, or women share with me that when their male partner is too emotional or too expressive or too vulnerable, that it's a little bit of a turn off. That it's
shakes up the dynamic.
Yeah, and they're kind of not used to it, and they kind of want their male partner to take the lead a little bit more and to be a bit more assertive. And so I want to acknowledge that there, for some partnerships and for some dynamics, there probably might be a time where if you're being too expressive and too emotional and too vulnerable, quote unquote, too vulnerable, as if that's a thing, that you're I'll use a heterosexual example, that your female partner might go, that's a bit of a turn off for me. Like that doesn't get me aroused, or doesn't make me feel attracted to you. And so that's one way of answering that question. Another way of answering this question is, like, I like to talk about emotional regulation, right? And there's a difference between like being emotionally expressive and just like almost like emotional vomit, just like spewing it out there, and like there being no rhyme or reason to the expression, it just being like this huge cathartic release. Yeah, totally. No agreements with your partner about what can come up and what can be held space for, versus like being emotionally regulating with your expression and being like, okay, cool. I know that I'm choosing to express this, and I don't necessarily need my partner to be my therapist right now, because I can manage this and handle it myself, but it's important for me to kind of share this and be authentic about what's coming up for me and be genuine in my expression of it. But I'm not going to go off the rails here and have this huge cathartic emotional breakdown, so to speak, with regards to that experience. So that's a piece that I teach a lot of men in my personal work with them is that emotional regulation piece, and learning how to like identify emotions not only mentally and cognitively, but also physically as well. Like there's physical components to emotions, and starting to like process that and just have a tool belt of things to do in order to like maintain those emotions, and not kind of shove them down and push them down and forget about them, but also not to just like let them explode out of you. Like the image that I have is like road rage, for example. Like there's a lot of anger. A lot of guys are carrying a lot of anger and frustration. They don't really know what to do with it, and they either push it down and pretend it's not there, or they let it explode through in inappropriate circumstances, and they scream, or they hit someone, or they do something like really violent. So it's like, okay, how can we regulate that anger and give it a purposeful outlet or a creative outlet or a healthy outlet, I suppose. And so that's another way of kind of answering that question is like, if you can regulate your own emotions and you're not trying to make your partner your therapist, then you can definitely like not be too vulnerable, so to speak, as long as it's kind of within that context.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like being expressive with your emotions in the bedroom, even if that's like part of what comes to mind for me there is like being expressive with, in a way, your pleasure, which is where I think often a lot of men, at least in my experience, have been kind of like bottled up in that. And there's also a lot of like stigma and, I want to just say like meanness around men who like, you know, in movies and in comedy, you know, it's like making fun of like how they come and like, you know, what facial expressions they're making. And then it's just like, you're supposed to just kind of, you know, thrust and just like, you know, just come. And maybe there's like a sigh, but otherwise like not much else is coming out of you. And so I'm wondering, you know, I think just through my own exploration of, you know, how I express pleasure in my body has gotten a ton more vocal, a ton more like full body, like everything. I could see where for men stepping into that would be really terrifying.
Yeah. And you're right. Like it gets made fun of. It's the butt of a lot of jokes in movies and TV shows, like the vinegar strokes joke, and like the O faces for guys, like and like making noise as well is like quite stigmatized in general, but even probably more so for men. It's kind of fetishized for women, and it's kind of like stigmatized for men. It's a bit of a weird thing. But yes, like something that I tell people in general is make more noise when you're having sex. Not only sex with a partner, but sex with yourself as well. Yeah. Because, at least in my humble opinion, sound is connected to pleasure, and the more sound that you make, the more pleasure you'll experience. If you're doing that with a partner, the more you will invite them to make sound, and the more pleasure they'll experience, and it becomes this beautiful, positive snowball effect. Yeah. But yeah, making noise for men is a big barrier for a lot of them, and there's this again. It comes back to like. I said fear before, but I think maybe anxiety is a bit more of an apt term. There's a lot of anxiety around looking a certain way sexually and fulfilling a certain role, and the guy doesn't make noise. Like if you're watching porn, like there's no, you maybe hear a little bit of grunting and a little bit of, oh, fuck yeah, but that's about it, right? Like there's no other noises coming from the male performer. So yeah, there's this... there's this fear around like breaking the mold, so to speak, and kind of being expressive of your pleasure. And again, that ties into like, okay, well, if I was going to do that, then like, and I'm going to show my pleasure, am I going to come quickly? Like like guys can have this, I guess, like blockage when it comes to like really dropping in, having this really intense, pleasurable experience because they think it's going to make them get to that finish line quicker. And oftentimes it does if they've got no like skill set, or they haven't learned like how to slow down and how to breathe and how to kind of like build up that pleasure. And it just kind of like comes to them real quickly. Then they go from 0 to 10, and then all of a sudden they've ejaculated. And for a lot of people, when ejaculation is the end of a sexual experience, unfortunately, that's the way it's kind of been framed. I like to talk about like the unspoken symbolism of ejaculation, and oftentimes one of the stories we have about ejaculation is that's the end of a sexual experience. So there's this fear of like, oh, if I really let go and experience pleasure, then I'm going to come too quickly and it's all going to be over, or I'm going to look weird, right? My partner's going to think that I'm strange and weird because I'm like really dropped into my pleasure, and I'm not fulfilling that kind of masculine, quote unquote, dominant role. So you're right. There's a whole bunch of things that pop up as resistances for men in terms of expressing themselves in the bedroom.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's a little bit of kind of like what Brene Brown talks about of foreboding joy. It's like you don't want to let yourself feel that pleasure, that joy, that good feeling. You don't want to let yourself feel that for fear of something else happening, right? Like it going away, you being made fun of, you freaking your partner out, whatever it is. But I think also like to kind of combat that in a way. Like for men, I mean, it's like, yeah, you think about how much joy and gratification they get for the noises that they hear their female partner make. Like, why can't that be reversed? You know, I think like if I'm giving someone a blowjob, if I'm giving them oral sex and they start making more noises, I then feel like, oh, that's right. Like, yes, you're welcome. Where I'm like, okay, I'm doing something right here. I'm doing something that they like, right? And then that can involve like some communication as well and whatnot. But I think like noise is such a signifier throughout your sexual experience, and you're helping to like communicate different things with your partner. That's like definitely something I feel like we should be ridding away with, that like it's okay for men to be expressive during sex. I want to transition a little bit here to solo sex. There's a ton of taboo, I think, and literally just last night I was rewatching an old Kevin Hart stand-up, and he's talking about the fleshlight and this battle he has with the fleshlight that his wife packed for him when he went out for a filming in a different state. And, you know, this like shame around like, I'm not going to be the dude that uses a fucking sex toy. Like, I don't need a sex toy. Like, how dare she even think I needed to use a sex toy, kind of a thing. And then he uses it, you know, and he's like, it's so good. But then also this like shame of like seeing himself in the mirror of like fucking this thing, and like just how like, just the whole time he was talking through it, I was just like, oh yeah, this is just like a lot of shame and a lot of taboo around like male sex toys or sex toys for penises. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to like the taboos around the sex toys that are used for penises.
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing to note is like those sex toys get relegated to kind of the bottom of the hierarchy when it comes to the conversations around sex toys. Oftentimes it's very vibrator centric. Like there's a lot of amazing stuff that's for people that have vulvas. But, you know, the quote unquote male sex toys or sex toys for people with penises often get pushed to the bottom of the conversation, and they're like, I guess like really quite stigmatized because I think there's this story around male sexuality that it's very simple, it's very linear, it's very straightforward. It's like almost like quite, what's the word, like animalistic in a sense. Like it's just like guys can just use their hand and jerk off like a chimpanzee furiously and until they get an ejaculation, and that's all they kind of need. It's just like friction oriented, and then, you know, a 5-second sticky white crotch sneeze, as I've said before, at the end of their experience. And so because that's our mentality when it comes to like male self-pleasuring or male masturbation, that instant gratification that I was speaking about before is like very prevalent. So when we think about like guys that want to explore more pleasure, or that want to use a toy, or that want to kind of go a little bit deeper and longer and more intense with their self-pleasuring and masturbation, the piece that often comes up for a lot of people, particularly for men, is like, what's kind of wrong with me? What, am I a bit of a weirdo? Am I a bit of a creep because why don't I just use my hand and jerk off like a regular guy, like a quote unquote normal guy, like what every other guy is doing pretty much. And so like there's this, this fear of being thought of as a weirdo, as a creep, as a loser. There's another story that pops up of like particularly guys that are using masturbation sleeves, that kind of fleshlight style masturbatory aid, is like, oh, I'm a bit of a loser because I can't get a real partner. I can't get a real woman. I've got to use this kind of fake vagina or a fake mouth or whatever it is. And so that often pops up for a lot of men in terms of like that resistance, to using toys. And then there's like, I guess historically the way particularly male sex toys or sex toys for penises have been marketed. This is an interesting kind of history. It's like all these back alley, sleazy, slimy advertisements for fleshlights and for male sex toys, like have been that's just kind of been the norm. Like it's always been like focused on, I don't know if people have listening have ever been into an adult shop or a sex toy shop, but like a lot of the packaging for male sex toys is like just women with their breasts out, and it's like very objectifying and you know, playing into this idea of what male sexuality quote unquote is, right? Or the way that we've kind of packaged it in society. And so so a lot of guys, particularly guys who are open to exploring more of their sexuality, who might be open to using sex toys, are put off by that marketing because they're like, oh, I'm not this greasy slime ball, you know, who wants to, you know, stick his dick in this hole. Like, I actually want to explore more. And that's what I found with exploring more of my sexuality using toys is like half the stuff that's been marketed to me as a guy, I'm like, I don't want to buy into that. Like what, you know. So that's been an interesting kind of observation that I've seen with regards to like the more contemporary, let's say, sex toy organizations, or maybe the more mindful and intentional sex toy companies that are, you know, advertising in more meaningful ways and saying like, hey, this can be a really beautiful way of exploring and expanding your pleasure, not just trying to sell a silicon sleeve to, you know, some, you know, guy who's perpetuating that stereotype of the way male sexuality is. So I think that plays into it as well, as guys don't want to like, they don't want to be that quote unquote that guy. There's a fear of being, you know, that creepy dude as well. So there's a few things in there that I think relegate male sex toys to the bottom of the pile.
Yeah. I remember I did an ad last year for a masturbation sleeve for penises, and it was definitely a mixed bag. It was definitely a mixed bag of feedback there. And I was able to still kind of pick up a little bit, you know, on like, there is some shame here for like people that would maybe want to use that it sends some kind of message that like their hand isn't enough, or, you know, that they can't like whatever it is. Just seemed very silly. And I think also feels slightly familiar with at least my, and I don't think I'm alone in this, but, you know, using sex toys in general, I think also have this kind of shame around them that like, you must be so desperate or you must be so lonely. And I think for cishet white men that it's extra shamey and extra guilty and telling of their value, because so much of their gratification and experience and pleasure and purpose in sex is through getting that gratification of a female.
Yeah, so. Totally. Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I've done similar posts and have got mixed responses from guys saying how much of a loser I am for using, you know, sex toys, and then other guys being like, this is amazing, finally someone's talking about male sex toys. And, you know, and so it's just, it's quite an interesting, you hit the nail on the head, mixed bag of responses when it comes to talking about particularly male sex toys for sure.
Yeah, well, and I'm curious about one kind of toy that goes into one particular part of the body that also maybe leads us to having a little bit of time here on this part of sexuality. And that would be a thing like a butt plug or like a prostate massager. And there is so much shame and guilt and disgust, I find, around the conversation of prostate pleasure for cishet white men, that I'm not fucking gay. That's the exit door. That's just for shit. Nothing comes in. It's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, man, we could do a whole podcast just on this alone. In fact, I have done whole podcasts on this topic alone, but there's an amazing resource by Charlie Glickman called The Ultimate Guide to Prostate Pleasure, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested in this kind of topic. But and what he identifies and what I've seen in the clients that I've worked with is like a couple of big fears around prostate play and any type of anal stimulation. And some of those are, like you've mentioned before, the fear of like disgust, I suppose. Like this is like it's going to be gross. Like it's an exit hole, not an entry hole. Like poo comes out of there. Like, oh God, it's going to be gross. And it's like that's a pretty easy thing to mitigate, right? Like the hygiene factor is what I think Charlie Glickman calls it. And so that's easy enough to mitigate. It's like just shower, use a douche, like use a condom if you're worried. Like there's plenty of ways you can make sure that it's hygienic. Another fear that comes up is it's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. And I find it really interesting to find out where that story comes from, because if you've never done it before, how do you know it's going to hurt? You know, that's a question that I have to a lot of men when I talk about this to them. And those two stories that pop up are like why it might be painful is prostate exams at the doctors and horror stories from other men, from their fathers, from whoever, and even the way it's portrayed in some movies and stuff, the snap of the glove and like cough as I enter and like no lube, like it's just portrayed as this really horrible thing. And then also the other story, which is probably more prevalent, is like anal sex portrayed in pornography. And a lot of the time the pain is actually emphasized in the porn because that's, you know, there's a whole porn genre called painal, which is like the painful anal sex, which is a really horrible thing to put out there. But so that's another reason why that story comes up. And I tell guys, look, if you're not doing it correctly, it'll hurt. But if you're relaxed and if you're using lube and if you're doing it properly and here's some strategies for doing it, it's going to be super pleasurable and it's not going to hurt at all. So again, that's another relatively easy thing to mitigate. That's the pain factor. The hardest thing to overcome, which you have mentioned before, is the like the homohysteria, the homophobic kind of fear. And whether it's internalized or whether it's like super overt, like that's, you know, a lot of guys use that language online, unfortunately. But the fear is that like, if I do this, I will be gay. Like as if there's a switch inside your anus that you press and it turns you into a gay man. But I like to share two surveys with regards to this. There was a survey done on you know, gay couples, gay men, and there was a survey done on heterosexual couples. And the questions were pretty similar. Were how frequently do you partake in anal penetration, anal stimulation? And the homosexual couples said about 1 in 3 times. So every time they're being sexual, they have anal sex, or they do some type of anal stimulation 1 in 3 times. And they asked a similar question to the heterosexual couples, and they specified anal stimulation on the male partner. And the results came back of 1 in 4 times that they were doing it, so 25% of the time. And I would hazard a guess and say, because there's a bit of stigma around admitting that you are doing some sort of anal stimulation on yourself or as the male partner, that it would probably be 1 in 3, and they'd be similar rates. So, and the reason why it's a similar rate, at least in my humble opinion, is because everyone has an anus, and we are human beings, and we do things pretty much statistically, on average, the same. At the same rate, at the same frequency. And so this idea that like anal penetration is solely the domain of gay men is like things that, I know Joe Court talks about this as well.
Your anus
like
does not have a sexual orientation.
Totally, yeah. Your prostate doesn't have a gender, so you can, you know, and especially if you're doing it like with a partner as well. If you're a guy, if you're a straight guy and you're having sex with a straight woman, and regardless of what the two of you do together, that's still, by definition, straight sex. Like it just blows my mind that like the logic that these guys like jump through to try and validate their homophobia, I suppose, is crazy. But
to try to protect their heterosexuality.
Yeah, totally. That kind of fragile heterosexuality, right? That fragile masculinity. So that's a big one that I work through a lot of guys with, and there's some amazing surveys done by adult toy companies. So you obviously take them with a grain of salt, but they've seen huge upticks in prostate massage sales and like other surveys done with regards like the percentage of men that have explored their anal play or prostate play, and it's like upwards of like 70% now of men that have like tried it in these surveys at least. So there's like this more openness, I suppose, and there is this kind of slow trend for guys to feel more comfortable kind of doing it and exploring it and asking for it as well, like asking their partners to kind of do something with them with regards to that. But yeah, there's still those huge big blockages, unfortunately, and when guys see other guys online, saying how gay it is or saying how bad it is to do it, then it just perpetuates those fears, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's really a shame how much we let shame prevent us from fully living and experiencing pleasure in our sex lives and our bodies. It's a lot.
Yeah, totally. And there's so much like value in just exploring your body in general, but like also to keep in the same vein of what we've been talking about, like prostate stimulation and anal play like opens you up to prostate orgasms, for example, and allows you to kind of like experience pleasure in different ways. It allows you to become multi-orgasmic because prostate orgasms don't involve an ejaculation. Like it helps with prostate health and prostatitis and sexual function. It helps with like reproductive health as well. If you're trying to conceive, sperm motility and mobility increases through prostate massage. Like there's just so like releasing tension from your anus as well. Like guys hold shitloads of tension in the sphincters. It's like relaxing that and massaging it, like getting a massage in your shoulder to release tension from your neck is super beneficial for you. Like there's just actually so much like betterment. You become a better lover as well. Something I like to talk about is like once you learn what it's like to be penetrated, you become a better penetrator as well. Like because you have this experiential understanding of how slow you need to go, how much lube you need to use, how sensitive you need to be. Like it just, there's like, when it's done properly and healthily and I guess like with consent, if you're doing it with another person, like there's only good things that can come from it, at least in my mind. Yeah. So and extending that to like the rest of your body as well. Like start touching your nipples, start like touching your face, start including other areas of your body in your self pleasuring only has good things to it. And one of the to speak into another fear really briefly, one of the reasons why there's a lot of resistance for men to do that is, again, tied back into that phallocentric idea of what sex is supposed to be, and especially masturbation as well. As like my pleasure comes from my cock, or the pleasure I give comes from my cock. Once men start focusing on other areas of their body and moving away from their penis, that's a fear of like, oh, now I'm not just my cock, I'm one big dick, But something else that can happen is when you start focusing on the pleasure that you experience in your anus or the pleasure that you experience in your chest or your face, is sometimes your penis goes soft or it gets less hard. And because we're so focused on erections as well, that's something we haven't really talked about, but like the erect penis, the fear of the flaccid penis is what I like to talk about.
I like that. I don't like that, but it really flows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's what happens. Like if you're focusing on another area of your body, sometimes your penis will go soft or it'll go less hard. And guys can go, oh my God, what is wrong with me? I'm experiencing pleasure and I'm enjoying myself, but my penis isn't hard. Something must be wrong. And so that brings up a lot of stories around like what, again, challenging those ideas of like what sex should look like, what masturbation should look like, what their anatomy should be doing. And if it's not doing the quote unquote correct things, then something's amiss, something's wrong. So, so that's another hindrance that people have, or men have, to exploring other areas of the body is what happens when they do.
Yeah. Well, I love overall that you're doing this work. I think this is I know there's a lot of shitting on cishet white men, and I know there's a lot of times that I don't like cishet white men, but it is still so important that they do have space to be able to heal and to be able to hold space for themselves. Because I think in so many ways, the things that at least personally frustrate me and hurt me from cishet white men are because of the things of how they are shutting themselves off from themselves. And then in a way kind of perpetuating that harm out in other areas. I've worked with a few clients on this around, the relationship with their penis and how they show up in sex. And it's beautiful, beautiful work to do with people. And I'm sure it definitely is a different experience coming from someone like yourself who they can also see themselves in maybe a little bit or relate to. I'm wondering here, I guess to kind of wrap us up here on this question, and then to kind of lead into maybe where people can find you as well. But a question of what can I do as a beginner in experiencing pleasure? I've been reading and listening to great minds, but I need to take more action. And it sounds like, after this podcast, even like where people can find you and probably like your coaching services and everything, but what other steps like action wise you would recommend to men?
Yeah. So some like real simple things that you can start doing, I speak you collectively here to people with penises, I guess, is some of the things we've talked about, like start exploring, like lean into your curiosity and start exploring other areas of your body. There's a really beautiful practice called pleasure mapping, which is, I just recommend this to literally everyone that I talk to. Just spend like a minimum of 20 minutes, start at your toes, slowly work your way up to the top of your head and just touch yourself in different ways. Like most of us have these beautiful tools on the end of our arms which can pinch and pull and slap and push and grab and fold and do all these crazy things. And a lot of that is enjoyable, is pleasurable. So, spend some time just exploring your body. I kind of think of it as like this map of topographical map of terrain, and a lot of men only have this one section of this map filled in, which is their genitals. It's typically just their penis, and so if you can fill in the rest of that map and get really like detailed information about the rest of that map, not only are you learning more about your own sexuality and having this robust kind of understanding of it, you then have got something to share with your partner. You can be like, hey, I really love when I squeeze my feet. Do you mind doing that? Or I really love like scratching my chest. Can you do that as well? And so you start to, something I like to call sexual leadership, is you kind of like start to take the lead in that really horizontal way rather than that kind of like hierarchical way. So you invite your partner into your own pleasure. So that's something I would suggest, is like lean into your curiosity. You start exploring other areas of your body. Like you use lube. Like if you're not exploring other areas of your body, if you're just like still masturbating using your hand in that kind of very stereotypical jackhammer way, just add lube and notice.
Not lotion, lube.
Yes, lube, yes. And just notice what changes. Notice how that pleasure shifts for you. If you're always sitting down when you masturbate, stand up when you masturbate next time and notice how that feels. If you're like... if you stand up sometimes when you masturbate, try moving around, try moving your body a little bit. I like to talk about Joseph Kramer's porn yoga, and just start breathing a little bit differently when you masturbate. Shake your body when you're masturbating. Like do certain things and notice how your body experiences pleasure a little bit differently. And a lot of that is that's really basic information, but I like to really expand on that in the work that I do. Like if I'm talking about my own coaching services, I suppose, like I work one-on-one with a lot of men, and I help them develop what I call a self-pleasure practice, which is like a daily practice where they tune into what's pleasurable for them, and that might not even look like masturbation, right? Masturbation falls under the umbrella of self-pleasuring, but it's really what you yourself find pleasurable in that moment, and that might not even include genital touch and genital stimulation. So if you can tune into pleasure, just doesn't have to be explicitly sexual, but just pleasure in general through mindful eating, through smelling the rain when it comes down, like whatever it might be that really gets into your senses and has this pleasurable sensory experience, then you can then slowly start to get this ball rolling. So it's like if you're looking for guidance, like more in-depth and more personalized guidance, like I do offer that one-on-one coaching, but I've also got a course. I've got a course, 6-week online course called Outperform a Porn Star, which is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title because the first thing in that course is we fully debunk and deconstruct the porn model of sex. Nice. And I often say, I say to these guys, like, if you can if you can learn how to separate ejaculation and orgasm, if you can learn how to have multiple orgasms, if you can learn how to actually experience pleasure and not just put on a performance and share that with your partner and communicate and talk and ask for consent and do all these crazy, amazing, beautiful things, like you'd be well outperforming any porn star that you see on screen. And so like we fully just deconstruct that whole mindset of performance over pleasure. And that's a really condensed 6-week version of a lot of the stuff that I do in my one-on-one coaching. But but it's intense and it challenges a lot. Not only is it like physical, because I think it's really important not only to give physical tools and skills to learn, but it's also really important to challenge a lot of those stories, right? A lot of the coaching that I see out there for men is just like, do your Kegel exercises, like learn how to breathe, like do these physical things that are going to help you have better sex, which is great. But I feel like that's only half of the equation, maybe even less than half. I feel like a lot of the work that needs to be done is rewriting the way that you think about sex and challenging those stories and opening up to different and alternative and new ways of thinking about sexuality and masculinity. So that's also what a lot of the course is. It's like just prompts and reflections and deconstruct. Like I'm big on media literacy as well. So I'm like, here's some critical examinations of the media that you're watching and things like that. So, that's a shameless plug, I suppose. Thank you for letting me put that in there. But yeah, that's something that you can do as well is go down and get some personalized guidance if you're wanting to like really tune into what's available to you as a human being, really, as a person with a penis. Yeah.
I love the emphasis on the media reflection, because I think that's so powerful, and that's something that like we just internalize and just it gets absorbed directly into our lives and how we show up. So I think that's so critical to be as a part of that course, as a part of your coaching. I don't want to keep you much longer. I know you have a little baby to get back to. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of last reflection here on just how you've noticed for yourself, your relationship with your own sexuality, your relationship with your penis, how that's been impacted by being a new father.
Yeah, this is, that's okay. This is it's still very new for me. Our son is only 3 weeks old, but like our sexuality, myself and my partners, the way that we connected with one another changed throughout pregnancy. So that was a big thing. Like her body was changing, her hormones were changing, and like something that I shared on a couple other podcasts is like I'm not attracted to pregnant women. You know, like that's not a turn on for me. Pregnancy doesn't turn me on, so to speak. If I think of like what my arousal patterns are. But like I'm attracted to my partner, but I'm not necessarily attracted to like the pregnant body, a pregnant woman's body. I think it's like amazing and beautiful, but it's not a turn on for me. So like navigating that space was quite interesting. And then like that changed the way that we were kind of being intimate with one another and the things that she wanted to do and the things that she could physically do sexually as well kind of changed. So that's been an interesting journey. And we as soon as we kind of figured that out, she wasn't pregnant anymore, and now we've got a baby. So things are kind of changing and evolving like really quite quickly. And now there's a human being literally physically in between us a lot of the time. So we try and like something that we've just taken for granted is the amount of hugs that we give each other and just like physical closeness, which has been very difficult with a crying or breastfeeding baby. You can't kind of give that full-bodied hug. So the physical touch has kind of been a little bit different and kind of figuring out how we can do that. So, yeah, it's a bit of a wild ride and I'm looking forward to kind of like once I've got my head around it, sharing a bit more about it on my social media and on my Instagram and things like that because, I don't think, at least I haven't seen a lot of parents, particularly fathers, talking about sexuality as they enter into parenthood and fatherhood. So, I love that I do this work because I'm not allowed, I have the comfortability to kind of talk about it and express it and share kind of my own personal experiences, and my partner's super okay with me talking about it as well. So, I'm excited to maybe be a little bit of a voice for fathers as well, now that I'm kind of here and in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like we definitely hear a lot of that from mothers and how that, changes their relationship with their body, changes their relationship with sex. And I definitely don't think men even necessarily feel safe to be able to share some of the, hardships of that and some of the struggles that maybe are associated with it, and maybe even some of the turn-ons, maybe even for the people that do feel turned on and learn new things that give them arousal. So definitely an area I'm looking forward to hearing you share a little bit more on. And I know you mentioned your Instagram. Can you share your Instagram and any other places on the internet, or I don't really think in person, but anywhere else on the internet of where people should look for you? We'll have the links to all of your stuff in the episode notes, but if you want to share with people your Instagram and anything else.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm at the Cam Fraser on all social media platforms. That's like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all of the above. I try and diversify my audience as much as possible, which is a bit of a nightmare, I'll be honest. But I love, particularly my Instagram account is where I put a lot of educational information up there. My promise is that if you jump on my Instagram account, that you'll learn something new. Like I try and be as educational as possible online, and that's my kind of, that's the highest value to me is education. So if you jump on there, I'm sure you'll learn something.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks for having these conversations and having a platform to talk about all this. I think it's really important, and I'm super grateful.
Yeah, of course.
All right, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. I mean, part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.